They heard it before they saw it. A violent tearing sound ripping through the mist, sharp cracks colliding with one another so fast they blurred into a single rolling roar, a sound that did not behave like ordinary rifle fire and refused to obey the calm logic German soldiers had learned to trust. In the grey half-light of early morning, with fog hanging low over hedgerows and wet leaves clinging to boots, the patrol halted instinctively, men crouching, hearts thudding, fingers tightening on triggers as the noise multiplied and echoed. Someone whispered that it had to be an entire American company up ahead. Another swore it was worse, maybe battalion strength, because no platoon could possibly produce that much fire without pause. The firing did not come in careful, spaced shots, but in a relentless rhythm, crack, 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 overlapping and continuous, as if the forest itself had learned how to shoot. Only minutes earlier the patrol had advanced with confidence. The front was fluid, the maps unreliable, but intelligence suggested light resistance. The men expected a few scattered riflemen at most, perhaps a nervous outpost to be brushed aside. Instead, the first burst of sound dropped them flat. Helmets pressed into mud, breath held, ears ringing, bullets snapped overhead, slashing through branches, chewing bark from trees, clipping the air with a vicious hiss that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Training told them to identify firing points, count shooters, return fire in controlled bursts. None of that worked here. The noise refused to separate into individual rifles. It sounded like dozens of weapons firing simultaneously, never stopping long enough for the enemy to move or breathe. The German squad leader tried to shout orders, but his voice vanished into the chaos. He gestured instead, signaling men to crawl back, to find cover, to spread out. As they moved, the firing followed, relentless, accurate, pressing them down. This was not the familiar rhythm of bolt actions. There was no pause, no telltale gap after each shot. The enemy seemed to fire as easily as breathing. To men trained on rifles that demanded a deliberate motion between shots, the effect was terrifying. It suggested not just numbers, but confidence, discipline, and an abundance of firepower that could only belong to a large, well-supported force. What they could not see, what they could not yet imagine, was that fewer than 50 American soldiers lay ahead of them, stretched thin along a shallow rise, mud on their sleeves, eyes fixed down iron sights. Each man held the same rifle, heavy and solid, a weapon that clicked and snapped and recoiled with mechanical certainty. The Americans were not rushing their fire wildly. They were firing fast because they could, because their rifles fed themselves, chambering fresh rounds without conscious effort. Each squeeze of the trigger produced a sharp report and an immediate readiness for the next shot. In that moment, speed itself became a weapon. The Americans had learned quickly what their rifles could do. In training, instructors told them to pace their shots, to conserve ammunition, but combat had a way of rewriting rules. When contact was made, when movement had to be stopped, they fired rapidly and decisively. The goal was not merely to hit targets, but to dominate the soundscape of the battlefield, to convince anyone listening that resistance was hopeless. They fired in overlapping rhythms, one man shooting as another reloaded magazines, creating a continuous wall of noise. To them, it felt like survival. To the enemy, it sounded like annihilation. Pinned in the mud, the Germans listened and calculated. They counted seconds and lost count again. They tried to distinguish individual positions and failed. Reports crackled back through field radios, voices tense and urgent. Heavy enemy fire, multiple automatic weapons, unable to advance, requesting support. The words moved faster than reality, transforming a single platoon into something far larger on paper. Somewhere behind the lines, officers frowned at maps and wondered how an American company had moved so quickly into that sector without being detected. The fog thickened, swallowing shapes and distances. Every muzzle flash seemed closer than the last. The Germans fired back when they could, bolts cycling with familiar resistance, shots spaced by fractions of seconds that suddenly felt like eternity. Each time a bolt lifted and slid, the enemy seemed to fire 3 more rounds. It created a sense of being outpaced, outmatched, caught in a losing equation that could not be solved under fire. Men began to believe that if they lifted their heads for too long, they would be cut down instantly. Ahead, the Americans adjusted positions, shifting knees in the mud, whispering quick updates. They did not know how frightened the enemy was. They only knew they had made contact and that the firing had to continue until movement stopped. The rifles grew hot, hands tightened, the rhythm never broke. Somewhere in the chaos, a soldier laughed briefly, not from joy, but from the raw disbelief of how much firepower he could unleash compared to anything he had known before. He remembered older veterans describing battles where every shot was precious, where men worked bolts and counted rounds. This felt different. This felt like momentum. As minutes dragged on, the psychological weight of the sound pressed harder than the bullets themselves. The Germans felt surrounded even though they were not. Every echo suggested more shooters, more positions, more danger. Orders filtered back down the line to hold, to wait for support, to avoid pushing into what was clearly a prepared American strongpoint. No one wanted to be the first to test that wall of fire. No one wanted to discover whether the company they imagined was real. The firing finally eased, not because the Americans had run out of ammunition, but because movement ahead had stopped. Entirely. Silence crept back in fragments, broken only by drifting smoke and the faint ringing left behind in ears. The Germans remained still, uncertain, afraid that the pause was a trick, that the enemy was repositioning for something even worse. When nothing followed, they began to withdraw cautiously, dragging themselves backward, still expecting fire at any second. They left behind churned earth, splintered trees, and a memory that would linger far longer than the skirmish itself. Later, when reports were compared and the truth surfaced, disbelief followed. How could so few men sound like so many? How could a single platoon create the illusion of overwhelming force? The answer lay not in numbers, but in a rifle that refused to pause, a weapon that turned individual soldiers into something larger than themselves, something that could bend perception and fear alike. And though the day would move on and the front would shift again, the echo of that relentless firing would stay with those who heard it, convincing them, long after the smoke cleared, that they had faced far more than they truly had. The confusion did not end when the firing stopped, because sound has a way of surviving longer than truth on a battlefield. As the German patrol pulled back, crawling and stumbling through damp earth, the memory of that relentless crackling followed them like an invisible enemy. Men spoke in low voices, replaying the noise again and again, each retelling making it larger, heavier, more impossible to explain. They were certain now that they had collided with a major American force, not a probing element, not an accident, but a deliberate block meant to halt any advance cold. When they reached relative safety and stood again, boots sinking into churned mud, officers demanded reports, and the men gave them honestly, describing what they believed they had faced. The language they used mattered. They spoke of automatic fire that never paused, of multiple firing points, overlapping perfectly, of disciplined control that suggested training far beyond that of a small unit. Words like platoon felt laughably inadequate, so they chose company instead, sometimes even larger. Maps were marked. Warnings were issued. Caution replaced aggression. In war, perception travels faster than bullets, and by the time anyone questioned the accuracy of the report, the idea had already taken root that this sector was thick with American infantry bristling with firepower. Behind the lines, German commanders debated their next move. The enemy, they believed, had concentrated forces here for a reason. Perhaps an armored thrust was coming. Perhaps this was the edge of something bigger. They ordered artillery to be prepared, units to dig in, movements to slow. All of it cost time. And time was a resource neither side could afford. The Americans, meanwhile, were already shifting positions, advancing methodically, unaware that their rifles had done more than win a brief fight. They had altered the enemy's understanding of the battlefield. For the American soldiers, the rifle had become an extension of the body. It was heavy, solid, dependable, its metal worn smooth by constant handling. They trusted it in ways that were difficult to articulate. In training, they had learned how to strip it blindfolded, how to clear malfunctions in seconds, how to feel when the clip was nearly empty. In combat, that trust transformed into confidence. They knew that when they pulled the trigger, the next round would be ready without thought or effort. That certainty freed the mind to focus on movement, targets, survival. The psychological difference was profound. While other soldiers counted shots carefully, fearing the moment when a bolt would have to be worked under pressure, these men could keep their eyes forward, their rhythm uninterrupted. They could respond instantly to movement, pour fire into suspected positions, and shift aim without breaking pace. The rifle allowed them to maintain pressure in a way that felt almost unfair. It did not make them invincible, but it gave them an edge that multiplied when used together. As they moved deeper into contested ground, the Americans noticed something strange. Resistance ahead often melted away before contact was fully made. Shots would ring out briefly, then stop. Sometimes prisoners were taken who seemed shaken beyond what the brief exchange should have caused. These men spoke of overwhelming fire, of being pinned by what sounded like entire formation. The Americans listened, puzzled, slowly realizing that their rifles were doing more than killing or suppressing. They were shaping fear. One soldier recalled later how he and a handful of others had held a thin line along a ditch, firing whenever movement appeared. They expected a counterattack that never came. Instead, the enemy withdrew, leaving behind equipment and wounded. At the time, it felt like luck. Only later did he understand that the sound of their firing had convinced the enemy they were facing something far larger. The rifle had turned scarcity into abundance, making a few men sound like many. German units adapted as best they could, but adaptation requires accurate information, and that was now distorted. Reports conflicted. Some officers suspected exaggeration, but few were willing to test that suspicion by advancing blindly into what might be a wall of fire. Caution hardened into doctrine. Movement slowed. Opportunities slipped away. In small, almost invisible ways, the balance shifted. The rifle itself became a subject of rumor. German soldiers spoke of Americans carrying semi-automatic weapons as standard, a concept that challenged long-held assumptions. They had encountered automatic fire before, but usually from machine guns with distinct sounds and firing patterns. This was different. This was everywhere and nowhere, from rifles that looked ordinary but behaved like something else entirely. The idea unsettled them. It suggested that every American infantryman possessed firepower once reserved for specialists. For historians, these moments would later blur into statistics and after-action reports, but for the men who lived them, the memory remained visceral. The sound, more than anything else, stayed sharp. Veterans on both sides would describe it years later the way it filled the air, the way it erased the spaces between shots, the way it made rational calculation impossible. In those seconds and minutes, the battlefield belonged to whoever controlled that sound. By the end of the campaign, the truth was known at higher levels. Analysts recognized how a simple technological choice had reshaped infantry combat. But on the ground, among soldiers crouched in mud and smoke, the impact was immediate and personal. The rifle had given a platoon the voice of a company, and in doing so, it had stolen time, confidence, and momentum from the enemy. Long before the final victory was declared, that advantage had already echoed through countless small encounters, each one tilting the war ever so slightly toward its end. The war did not end in a single thunderclap, but in a long fading echo, and within that echo lived the legacy of a rifle that had quietly reshaped how men understood combat. By the time the final advances were underway, the Germans no longer reacted with surprise to the sound of rapid American fire. They reacted with resignation. The noise had become familiar, almost expected, yet no less intimidating. It carried with it the memory of previous encounters, of ground lost and plans abandoned, of moments when courage had collided with a wall of sound and shattered. Even when American units were thin, exhausted, and far from supply, the enemy hesitated, haunted by what they believed awaited them. American platoons advanced through ruined towns and scarred countryside, their numbers worn down by months of fighting, their uniforms faded and patched. Yet the rifle remained the same constant presence, slung over shoulder, clutched in hands, leaned against walls during brief moments of rest. It was no longer just a tool, it was reassurance. Men trusted it to speak for them before they could, to announce their presence loudly enough to keep enemies at a distance. When contact came, they did not wonder if they could respond fast enough. They knew they could. In the final battles, this confidence mattered as much as any strategy. Urban fighting compressed distances and magnified sound. Shots bounced off stone and concrete, multiplying themselves in tight streets. A handful of Americans firing together could fill an entire block with noise, making defenders believe resistance was futile. Doors were abandoned. Positions were vacated. Sometimes white cloth appeared in windows almost immediately. The rifle did not merely win firefights, it shortened them. On the German side, morale eroded in subtle ways. Soldiers who had once trusted their discipline and marksmanship now doubted whether skill alone could overcome such firepower. They felt perpetually outgunned, even when they were not. Each engagement reinforced the sense that the Americans possessed an endless supply of men and weapons. This belief did not come from intelligence reports or captured documents, but from lived experience, from the unmistakable sound of semi-automatic fire that refused to slow down. Fear, once planted, proved difficult to uproot. When the fighting finally ceased, silence felt unnatural. Veterans later described how strange it was not to hear the rifle anymore, how their ears seemed to wait for a sound that never came. The battlefield grew quiet, but the lessons endured. Soldiers returned home carrying memories not just of sights and losses, but of sounds that had defined survival. Among them, the rapid crack of their own rifles stood out as both shield and weapon, a noise that had kept them alive. In the years that followed, analysts and historians debated tactics, doctrines, and decisions. Charts were drawn, comparisons made. But among infantrymen, the conclusion was simpler. They knew what had worked, because they had felt it in their hands and heard it in their ears. The rifle had given them an edge that numbers alone could not explain. It had allowed small units to fight above their weight, to dominate space, through sound and speed, to bend enemy perception until it broke. German veterans, too, spoke about it in later years. Some admitted that the fear had been as damaging as the bullets. They described moments of paralysis, of hesitation born from the belief that advancing meant certain death. They acknowledged that many times they had faced far fewer men than they imagined. The realization came too late to change outcomes. The illusion had already done its work. As armies around the world studied the war, the lesson was absorbed. Semi-automatic fire became the standard, not the exception. The idea that every infantryman should carry such capability traced directly back to those chaotic encounters where sound overwhelmed sense. What had once been revolutionary became expected, then taken for granted. Yet its origin lay in muddy fields and ruined villages, in moments when a platoon sounded like a company and survived because of it. For the men who carried the rifle, the end of the war marked a quiet separation. Weapons were turned in, uniforms folded away. Civilian life resumed awkwardly at first, but memory lingered. Some veterans would pause years later at the sound of rapid hammering or fireworks, momentarily transported back to hedgerows and streets where sound meant danger or safety. They understood better than anyone how noise could shape belief, how belief could shape action, and how action could decide fate. The rifle itself found new lives. Some were stored, others sold. Some carried into new conflicts under different flags. Its reputation followed it, growing with retelling. It became a symbol not just of American industry or military power, but of a shift in how wars were fought at the most human level. It represented the moment when individual soldiers gained the ability to project force far beyond their physical presence. Looking back, it is tempting to reduce the story to engineering and production numbers, to praise steel and design. But the true impact lived in the space between shots, in the way the absence of a pause unsettled those who listened. It lived in the decisions not to advance, in the orders to wait, in the retreat that began not with casualties but with fear. That is where the rifle truly changed the war. In the end, the battlefield was not only conquered by movement and maneuver, but by sound and perception. A single platoon, armed with rifles that spoke without hesitation, could rewrite the enemy's understanding of reality. And when the last shots faded and history closed a chapter, what remained was a simple, enduring truth, proven again and again. In mud and smoke and echoing fire, sometimes victory does not belong to the side with more men, but to the side whose weapon convinced the enemy they are already surrounded.